Good evening. Welcome to AEI and tonight's event, the Unhackable Internet, how rebuilding cyberspace can create real security and prevent financial collapse. We have Tom here tonight. He'll give us a brief preview of his book, and later he'll autograph copies AEI will provide you. We have a limited number of books, but they're on us. We also have two colleagues of mine with lots of financial experience here, Oonagh McDonald and Bert Ely, to offer their thoughts on Tom's newest book. The internet is everywhere. It impacts the way we communicate, receive news, take and send pictures, view movies and stream video, play games, bank, buy airline tickets, securities, groceries, cars, pay taxes. It makes working from home a viable alternative. It powers Uber and Lyfts, and likely autonomous vehicles someday soon. In the late 18 and early 1900s, whenever the country was faced with a ruinous financial panic, and there were many, it looked to merchant bankers for solutions like the House of Drexel in Philadelphia, the House of John Pierpont Morgan in New York, and others. Since that time, we've come to rely on the federal government. Because Fed Chairman Volcker caused an economic crisis to save the country from runaway inflation, it took some time before he was anointed with financial superhero status. But from the late 1980s onward, whenever there were financial storm clouds, the country looked to the government, a Federal Reserve chairman, a Treasury secretary, some government official to save the day. So in the modern Financial Crisis Hall of Fame, we have a pantheon of government superheroes who have staunched panics and restored the nation to normalcy. To refresh your memory, I've dusted off some pictures I have of these anointed officials. There's a shot of Alan Greenspan back in the day, saving Wall Street. There's another one of Ben Bernanke slashing interest rates to save us from the Great Recession. We've got Vice Chairman Stanley Fischer here suited up to save us from the evil threat of shadow banks. And we've got Janet Yellen, who just recently had to use her powers here to short-circuit the SVB bank run. So the U.S. is not unique in its hall of financial superheroes. Europe has some too. And on the left here, we have Governor Mark Carey of the Bank of England suited up as Iron Man here. He's protecting us from the financial fallout of the crisis. And on the right, we have the ECB Chairman Mario Draghi, who is slashing interest rates to negative territory to save the ECB from crisis. But what if the next financial panic is caused by a cyber attack that brings the financial system to a standstill? The attack disables access to bank deposits and cash from ATMs. People can no longer pay their bills or be paid their wages, use Netflix or order Uber Eats. Our current pantheon of financial system superheroes will likely be powerless against a cyber attack that successfully disables the internet and our electronic payment and communication system. How likely is such an attack? As the internet gets more intertwined in our lives with the rollout of 5G and smart devices, increasingly likely. And who are we supposed to call to fix when it happens? There's Dr. Evil perpetrating his next internet attack, and who are we going to call? These guys? Some government official or agency? That's a good shot of an unnamed government official there stopping a cyber attack. Which one? The Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency, which I never knew existed before I read this book. U.S. Cyber Command, another government agency. What's their phone number? Will their chat bots still be online, or will it be a casualty of the attack? Cell phone networks will likely be down. Will my old school telephone landline work? How do we protect ourselves from our digitally connected lives, from malware, theft, and other cyber crimes? Is it encryption, multi-factor authentication, zero-trust architectures? What are those? Limit the use of our cell phone apps? Unplug Alexa? Can our own individual cybersecurity efforts alone prevent the next Cybergeddon? Or do we need new robocops to police the internet? To answer these and related questions, we are lucky to have among us tonight a well-known expert on the subject. Thomas P. Vartanian, his accomplishments are many, too many for me to list. He is currently the director of the Financial Technology and Cybersecurity Center and the former executive director of the Program on Financial Regulation and Technology at George Mason University's Anton Scalia Law School, where he was a professor from 1983 to 2018. He chaired the financial institutions practices at 2 international law firms through 4 different financial crises. He was general counsel of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board and the FSLIC during the S&L crisis. He was chairman of the American Bar Association's Cyberspace Law Committee between 1998 and 2002. He's authored hundreds of articles and 8 books, including 200 Years of American Financial Panics, Crashes, Recessions, Depressions. He has appeared many times on Bloomberg TV, CNN, Fox News, and many radio shows. And I'm sure you've read many of his op-ed columns. Please join me in welcoming Tom Vartanian.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. We got to do one more clip to get your book back up there. There we go.
Thanks. Paul, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank AEI, Bert, Oonagh, and everybody who's made this possible. And I'd also like to thank my wife, who I think is back in Sarasota live streaming this, and my 2 daughters, Mackenzie and Alana, who are here trying to figure out why I've been writing books for the last few years and what it all means. This is an interesting moment because I checked this morning before I got here, and I've been doing promotion now for this book for the last 3 weeks since it came out. And in the time I've been doing the promotion for this book, it's my other book, which is selling like hotcakes because it's about 200 years of American financial panics, in which in chapter 14 I predicted where we are today. So in any event, I guess you can never figure out timing and what's going to happen at any particular moment, but here we are. So let me give you some touch points on what I've tried to do here. And my wife read it, and I put this in the epilogue to the book. When my wife read it, she looked at me and she said, "This is very scary." And I said, well, it's got a happy ending. There are solutions. And what I tried to do is make it both a realistic story and an entertaining story, because it really reflects what I've been doing the last 30 years and how I understand the mistakes that we've made. So it was 6 years ago this week that I walked into the White House to interview to become vice chair of the Federal Reserve. And I remember distinctly the 3 messages I was there to communicate in terms of what I wanted to do as vice chair were I to get the job. Number 1 was to start to increase interest rates slowly over a number of years so that banks could have a period of time to restructure their balance sheets. This was 2017. Because my view was that rates had been dangerously low for far too long. And if you know anything about financial institutions, they take in deposits and they have to lend them out. They have to put them somewhere. And so now we're reaping sort of the rewards of those low interest rate periods today. The second thing I said was that we needed to restructure financial regulation, that it is obsolete. It was created in the 1930s. It doesn't relate to the economy we have today. There's nothing today that looks like the 1930s. And the third thing I said was that technology has overrun financial services, both in terms of the development of products and the delivery systems. And unless we come to grips with technology and what it's doing and how it's doing it, and start to impose some oversight and regulation of where we're going, we are in for some real trouble. So unfortunately, I think some of those have now come to pass. And what I want to do is just talk a little bit about what I've written and why I've written it. So for the last 30 years, starting in the 1990s, I helped financial institutions get online. I helped them with their infrastructure and the legal issues to build an online banking system, to do joint ventures with firms that were providing them the technology or the space or sharing websites. And I remember vividly being in Swindon, England in 1997 for the rollout of Mondex Money. And everybody said that will be the money of the future. It is here. And of course, Mondex doesn't even exist today. It was way before its time. But the one thing I realized, and as I retired from the practice of law in 2018, began to think about all this stuff, the one thing I realized is we had all been captured by irrational exuberance for technology. Everybody said, this is the way to get to the customer. This is the way to get more customers. This is the way to become more efficient and make a bigger profit. Now, there's nothing wrong with any of that. All of that is perfect. All of it's great. But what we lost in the mix is the concern for what we were building and for the security or insecurity of what we were building. And so I look back after the 30 years of doing that stuff and said, my goodness, we made a huge mistake. We built the wrong internet. In 1969, when ARPANET was introduced and was a military communication facility, which then became a way for 4 universities to share research information, nobody could imagine that we would put every inch of data and every ounce of financial value on the internet. It wasn't built for it. It wasn't built to take everything that we've put on it. And so here we are now in this situation and have essentially made ourselves at risk to all the ne'er-do-wells in the world, all the criminals and adverse hostile nations, terrorists, who know how to take advantage of us in this situation. So Paul mentioned CISA, a cybersecurity industry oversight agency, and CISA is part of Homeland Security and doing as well as it can given the resources it had. And one of the regulatory problems we have with all of this is all of the agencies who are looking are enormously under-resourced. But CISA has a report on its website. You can look at it today. It's on the front page. 1 in 3 people in this country have malware on their computers right now. 47% of us have had our personal information taken, looked at, or hacked. And lastly, this is the most interesting one to me, 600,000 accounts are hacked every day in the United States. 600,000 every day. And so it's no surprise that you have this pantheon of companies that have been hacked, ransomware, all kinds of things. And you wonder where it all ends. And so what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about 4 things. First, the context. The context we're in is one, as I've described, where I think we have lost balance. It's not that technology isn't terrific. It's not that we don't need technology. We do need technology. It enhances the quality of life. But what we've done is we've lost our balance. Let me give you an example. There's nobody in this room sitting here right now that doesn't lock their doors at night. There's nobody that wants to live in a country that doesn't have an army protecting its borders. There's nobody who wants to live in a city that doesn't have police protecting them, right? But we do all of those things online. What we do online, and many people do it voluntarily, which is shocking to me, but what we do online is we essentially take all of our valuable papers, all of our intimate ideas, and we throw them on the front stoop of our house for anybody passing by to rummage through. That's the functional equivalent of what we're doing. But we wouldn't do that in the real world. So the context we're in is one that is quite striking. And when I gave one of these talks a few weeks ago, somebody asked me if I was engaging in hyperbole. How could it be that bad? Nothing happens. I go online all the time. And people just don't understand all of the data that's being gathered about them 24 hours a day. Your computer's on, it's being gathered. You got a cell phone in your pocket, there's data being gathered. You go on social media, data is being gathered. There's a great book that was written by Mark Goodman. It's called Cybercrimes. And there's 3 or 4 books I'm going to mention here that I think everybody should read to put some perspective around the question, am I engaging in hyperbole? Those books make my book look like a comic book. Cybercrimes talks about, it's done by a former LA cop who then went on to work on the FBI Cyber Task Force. And he talks about all the things he saw. And one of the things that caught my attention, because I do have two daughters, is an app that was for sale in 2012, both from, I think that was available from Google and Apple, called Girls Around Us. And the way the app worked is usually a male would download the app, and because of all of the data that was being collected from people, mostly women, from social media, cell phones, web surfing, and everything imaginable, all that data was being collected. It was being sliced and diced and reused and used and sold to these two guys who set up this company in Moscow and sold this app. And what the app did is, for example, if I went down the block to Starbucks and I opened up the app, it would tell me what women were within a mile of me, show me their picture and their social profile. Now, those women never signed up to be on that app. They never volunteered to be a part of that. But there they were in those apps for anybody to sort of flip through and think about whatever they want to think about. That kind of stuff is really unbelievable. The second thing I think that scares me in terms of the context and being on the clock here is China. China has said it's going to be dominant in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and have the largest economy by 2030. Put aside the economy for a second, because I think they're in for a rough road themselves. But if they are dominant, and their outspending is 10 to 1, if they are dominant in artificial intelligence and quantum computing by 2030, and if quantum computing turns out to be a fraction of what people think it can be, we are in trouble. And we're in trouble not because the internet gets even less safe. We're in trouble because if our economy is in jeopardy, our freedom is in jeopardy, and our democracy is in jeopardy. And if all you have to do is look at what China's doing in terms of the surveillance state that they have built, to know that we don't want them being dominant in anything on this planet. So there's a great book by Kit Stratmatter called We Have Been Harmonized. And he used to be a Chinese national. He now lives in the United States, I think the United States and London. And he wrote this terrific book about what it was like to be in China, where all of your information was collected either through an app you're required to have on your cell phone, or through social media, or through 300 million facial recognition cameras throughout China. And it's just unbelievable. And all that's backed up by an enormously massive police force. And so he tells the story about a child who listens to his parents one evening talking about the Chinese government and saying something slightly negative about the government. The next day, the child goes to school and tells the teacher about the conversation. The next morning, two police come to the house and arrest the parents. Now, if you don't like that, it gets even worse because everybody's getting a social score. Now, you can argue that as they do in China, that the social score is to make society better. But when you use it to start restricting people from using mass transit or sending their kids to school, or in the final analysis, if your social score is really horrible, you have to go to a re-education camp. That is not a country that we want dominating anything in this world. And frankly, they are making huge investments in South America and Africa, financing the technologies of those countries, and which I think is ultimately going to get them in some trouble given the leverage. But they are making huge investments around the world to sort of get into this role of dominant in the world of technology, dominant in the world of finance. One of the things I did in the book was look at what the government's done over the last 25 years, and that really made me angry. Because Bill Clinton, President Clinton, nailed it in 1996. Put out two or three executive orders, and I include all the executive orders, all the government reports, there's 100 of them in the appendix of the book, and if I were still practicing law, I would think that would be worth the price of admission for that book. But he got it. His people got it. They identified the issues, they identified the solutions, and they identified critical infrastructures. And for 25 years since then, we've done relatively nothing but cut and paste those Clinton administration directives and executive orders over and over and over again till March of 2021, when Joe Biden does the same thing that Donald Trump did, who did the same thing that Obama did. I mean, it's over and over and over again. And you realize that these are executive orders that are warning about dangers, but at the end of the day don't go anywhere, because an executive order can only direct a federal agency to do something. And so one thing I know from being in the government 8 years is that when you direct 24 agencies to do something, you've directed nobody to be responsible for anything. And that's essentially what's happened. Now, I give some credit to Joe Biden. He's taken this 2 steps further in terms of trying to impose liability on people that have imperfect networks, and I think that's a good step forward. And talking about zero trust architecture for the federal government and all the contractors that work for the federal government. So I think those 2 things will be important. So let me close here with some discussion of the solutions. Because as a lawyer, I said to myself, I couldn't just raise all these issues, talk about all these fears, and leave them unanswered. Because one of the things I learned representing Wall Street for about 40 years is you never walk into a room with anything less than 3 solutions. It's just the way that you learn to represent people like that. And so I came up with a number of solutions. My main solution, which I talk about at some length, is going back to where we were in banking in the 1970s. When I started in banking, bank regulation in the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency in 1976, every bank used secure, private, proprietary networks. There was no internet. Any banker, any payment systems person would have been horrified to do anything on an open architecture like the internet. 1994, the first bank in California, it was a credit union actually, opened up the first online banking system in America. And from that point forward, anybody who goes online today is connected to the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. Because once you get into the system, if you know what you're doing and you know how to meander your way through the system, you can go anywhere in that system. The banks are all connected to the Federal Reserve and the Treasury. And there's a great book about that called The Cuckoo's Egg. It was written in 1989. And it was extraordinarily interesting for 1989. What happened there was an astronomer was working at Berkeley Labs. And because he wasn't a physicist, he was an astronomer, they gave him the responsibility of balancing the computer time books at the end of each month. And so he came up in month 1, the first time he did it, with a 75-cent error. Somebody had used 75 cents of computer time at Berkeley Lab and hadn't taken responsibility for it on their budget. So he started looking. Everybody said, what are you worried about? 75 cents? But something looked wrong to him. And he kept going and he kept looking. And it's a convoluted, long story, but 2 years later, after the FBI completely rejected him because, number one, he couldn't tell them there was secret documents involved, or number two, he couldn't tell them that damages were more than $1 million. And they said, look, if we don't have those kinds of documents and we don't have $1 million at issue, we are not going to get involved, which is the case today, by the way. And so he kept going. He traced it all the way to a bunch of guys in an apartment in Munich who had penetrated the Berkeley lab. And who were they? Well, they just happened to be the KBG. And what were they doing? They had gotten in through the Berkeley lab. They hacked their way in. They named themselves administrators of the system. And once they did that, They had free reign of the system to identify additional people to come in, give themselves passwords, do whatever they wanted to do. And from there, where did they go? They weren't interested in the Berkeley labs. They weren't interested in what Berkeley was doing. What they were interested in is that Berkeley was connected with every Air Force base in the country. And so what they did is they went from there to Air Force bases. And from there, they hopped over to Air Force bases overseas. And so they had penetrated into the most intimate parts of our defense system. And it all started with a 75-cent hack, right? And nobody interested in a 75-cent loss. And so, look, how do we fix this? Authentication. Let's start with that. Why is it everybody can be anonymous online? Nobody could be anonymous in the analog world, right? My dog has a license, right? I mean, nobody can get around anywhere in the analog world without identifying themselves. You need a driver's license, a marriage license. I set up a consulting firm. I needed 22 different licenses and ways to identify myself. And why doesn't that happen in cyberspace? Everything of value has been put into a virtual world, but we are anonymous. We're unidentified. And when you authenticate yourself online, what are you authenticating? You are authenticating an IP address or a machine. You're not authenticating a person. And you're certainly not authenticating a person who's agreed to do anything or can get caught, right? And so you've created a system where hostile nations, criminal cartels, fanatics, and terrorists can wander around, do what they want online, and understand that it's very hard to identify them, and it's even harder to arrest them and punish them. And so you could read a lot of stories about how the mafia and criminal cartels are actually moving their main focus to online crime rather than physical crime. I don't know, maybe you don't get whacked anymore by the mafia. Maybe it's all done online. But the amount of time and effort it takes for them to do that, and the chances of getting caught and the pain and penalty, it makes sense for them to do that. And so you've got countries like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea hiring hordes of maverick hackers that are being paid basically to wreak havoc around the world. So when we see stories about the 2016 election and all of the problems we had there, is it any surprise? I mean, I read that stuff when it was said and it happened. I said, yeah, and there's gambling in every casino in Las Vegas. Why would we be surprised where there's no authentication, there's no rules for that kind of stuff to happen? Second of all, everything we do in our analog lives is subject to governance and rules. There is no governance in cyberspace. You know, there's all of these cyber associations. There's ICANN, there's naming, there's domain names, there's all of this, but there's no cyber cops. There's no cyber police. There's no cyber Coast Guard, right? So if your money was gone tomorrow morning, who would you call? Do you know the number of the cyber police? I don't. I know as much about financial services as anybody in the world, and I don't know who I would call. And I certainly would be pretty upset if all my money in my bank and all my money with my investment advisors was gone one morning. Can it happen? Well, if you were in Estonia in 2007, it happened to you. If you were in Brazil in 2016, it happened to you. If you were in the Ukraine last year, it happened to you. It can certainly happen. And if you say, well, you know, you're predicting a financial Armageddon, it won't happen, it's never happened. It has happened. It has happened. If you look at the total list of hacks, incursions, and all kinds of horrendous things that have happened online, you put them together. You put them together happening to one country at one time, that is a financial Armageddon. And so I come back to where I started, which is, I think we built the wrong internet. And I realized when I stopped practicing law and I started thinking about all the things we'd done, and I started reading a number of books. Richard Clarke, who worked for 4 presidents in the White House and was the cyber czar, wrote some wonderful books on this subject. Nicole Permuth wrote a book I always have to look at the title of this book. This is How They Tell Me the World Ends. She was the cyberspace cybersecurity reporter for the New York Times, still is, I believe. There's a lot of solutions. I include about 100 solutions in the book, and then I say at the end of them, they're not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. Businesses don't have an incentive to do it. Why? They're making more money from an insecure network than they're going to make from a secure network at this point. The dynamics, the economics have to change there for them to want to have a more secure internet. Users, people. If I told you that to fix the insecurity in the internet, your user experience would be a little more cumbersome, people would be horrified, right? People would say, look, we don't want government all over our internet. This is the space to be free. Well, yeah, I mean, that's what the crypto people said too, right? This is the space to be free. Now their lifeline to survival is to be regulated because they want the credibility that comes with somebody behind them saying, I'm watching them. And so there are a lot of solutions. And that's why I conclude that the one that makes the most sense to me is a heightened awareness of security on what I call secure private networks. And those should be used at least for critical infrastructures. There are 16 critical infrastructures, everything from transportation, the electric grid, financial services, at least for communications to and from and around those critical infrastructures and around the storage of data for those critical infrastructures. Those should be on secure private networks that you don't get on unless you've been authenticated to a human being, you agree to the rules of the road, and if you violate the rules, you agree that your presence in your application can be extinguished with a killer app or a killer switch. But you don't get to do what you want to do just because you want to do it when you're on those critical infrastructure networks. That is the only way I think we ever get to some sort of rationality in terms of what we're doing and some safety ultimately. Because if we don't, there's enough bad people out there, enough bad countries out there who are going to try to do something, going to try to take down various parts of the financial system. Now, will it be China? I don't think so. I don't think it'll be China. China doesn't get anything economically from taking down our economy because its economy will also be affected. We're its second largest trading partner. That doesn't make sense. But what happens when this technology gets into the hands of terrorists and fanatics who have no allegiance to any morality or country? And so one last point I'll make, and that is quantum computing and artificial intelligence. There's a great book by Max Tegmark, who's a professor at MIT. It's called Life 3.0. And Max talks about, and he's an artificial intelligence expert, he talks about the danger of allowing artificial intelligence to develop on its own without rules of engagement. Because he says, and if you've seen The Matrix or you even say 2001 Space Odyssey, he says eventually the machines will take over because they will be smarter than us and they will figure out how to take over. Now, whether that happens or not, I think his message is worthwhile, and that is we should be creating rules of engagement for all this technology. The technology is terrific. It's changed our lives in so many valuable ways. But if we don't write the rules to deal with the insecurities, to deal with the problems and deal with the threats, we will be going down a rabbit hole that we cannot get out of. And if we end up with countries like China being dominant with artificial intelligence or quantum computing, we are in big trouble. There's stories right now that China is trying to gather up all the encrypted data on the planet and store it. Why? Because they believe by 2030 they will have quantum computers which will be able to decrypt it, and they will be able to read everybody's secret in 2030. So, where are we going? One last figure. And I think this tells you everything you know about the dangers of technology. And I don't have to talk about the benefits of technology because we all enjoy them every day, right? Innovation, more jobs, profitability. But there's a report I read that RSA encryption, 2048-bit encryption, standard encryption used today. It will take a supercomputer today 300 trillion years to run a brute force attack against that encryption to break it. That's pretty good protection, right? 300 trillion years. Now, obviously, on a brute force attack, you could get it on try one, but if you have to go through all the permutations, it would take 300 trillion years. So that's not really worth trying. But take a quantum computer. So we already have quantum computers that have 256 qubits. When we get in the range of 5,000 qubits, scientists have estimated that that 5,000 qubit quantum computer will break RSA 2048-bit encryption, not in 300 trillion years, in 10 seconds. So that tells you the magnitude of what's going on here. Tells you that unless we get quantum cryptography first, every secret, everything that's online, everything that's stored today is going to be exposed to people who will take it. And that's the problem. So that's why I essentially concluded that we needed to write this book and talk about how we can change this. We can create a better internet, a safer internet. Scott Vollmer is here from Salt Lake City. He runs a software company there that is actually on that path. But it's going to take a lot of recognition and a lot of concern and a lot of grassroots businesses and people coming forward and saying, I want to fix this before it is too late. Because imagine yourself without power and imagine yourself without your money for 3 days. Just 3 days. What would you do? I know what people would do. People would be in the streets. That is not a happy event. And so every day we wait to fix this, it gets harder to fix. It's fixable. It may be a little costly. It may be a little cumbersome. It may be a little obnoxious. It won't be the internet that we know today, at least in some respects when we're dealing with critical infrastructures, but it can be a lot safer. And if we're going to put everything of value on it, we need to be thinking about that. Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction. And let me say, there's a lot in this book, a lot of really, a lot of stuff I learned. And you'll want to go home and unplug Alexa when you get there, if you've got one.
She's listening.
All the time. I've got two experts with me today that have read the book and are going to help us unpack what's in it. Speaking first is Oonagh McDonald. She's an author and senior advisor at Credo Capital, LLC. She's a former British Member of Parliament and Opposition Treasury spokesperson. She was a former independent director of the UK Financial Services Authority and the Gibraltar Financial Services Commission. She has served as a consultant with the Asian Development Bank and USAID, advising regulatory authorities, most recently in Ukraine. She is the author of several books, most recently Cryptocurrencies, Money, Trust, and Regulation. And speaking after Oonagh will be Bert Ely. Bert is an author and a banking expert. He's consulted on deposit insurance and banking issues since 1981. He was among the first to anticipate what became the S&L crisis. In recent years, he's focused his more attention on bank regulation, monetary policy, housing finance reforms, and the policies concerning Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac conservatorships. He serves as an expert witness in litigation cases triggered by bank failures and other types of banking-related lawsuits. And he has testified numerous times in Congress, before Congress, and he is a frequent speaker and author of commentary on financial industry issues. And so, join me in welcoming Oonagh.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here to comment on Tom's book. I must say, first of all, that it is an absolute tour de force. I didn't think I could read about so many agent government reports here of various kinds into the use of the internet. So it's a mass of wonderful information. looking at the weaknesses in the internet, I decided to look at a number of cases, sometimes affecting banking, sometimes affecting government organizations. And I found that there were two things common to all of them. First of all, it's those human beings, those wretched human beings who screw it up for banks and for government organizations. They are not always coming from Russia or China or North Korea. They are sometimes people who simply do not understand how the internet actually works and the importance of the various tasks that have been assigned to them. In fact, as far as banks are concerned, the most common sources of problems for banks are phishing, which can introduce malware into the banking system. But that could come from a customer, a client, as well as from inside the actual bank. And then, of course, there's the ransomware itself. Very often it is an inside job, but it isn't necessarily, not necessarily, that the mafia or somebody pretending not to be Russian or whatever, who is actually doing this in the bank. It's just the time taken for them to actually carry out quite pretty simple procedures. And that really is so often a part of a problem. For example, with the WannaCrypt ransomware attack. You look for an error, in that case in the server message block. Microsoft had fairly quickly identified that and provided a patch to deal with it. But the trouble is that the Microsoft computers were too old. They were still, for example, in some cases, using Windows XP, which Microsoft stopped supporting a long time ago. I looked at Equifax, you know, that major intrusion, not only into Equifax, but into thousands upon thousands of accounts. What went wrong at Equifax? A patch was announced on March the 7th. The administrators were told to fix it on March the 19th. March the 15th, a scan was run that was supposed to detect unpatched systems. It didn't work. So they didn't try again to figure out what was wrong and why that hadn't happened. And nothing was done until August. Following year, a traffic detection box, which was supposed to stop all incoming encrypted traffic and unencrypt it, was provided. But the key to using that had expired 10 months previously. No one noticed it until July 2017. So many months went by without action, straightforward actions, which people had been told to do, had taken place. And you do find that pattern repeated. I also looked at Solaware, and that was even more interesting, SolarWinds, excuse me, that they had many suppliers to them, but they never checked these suppliers. And it was one of the suppliers that wrecked that particular situation and made information widely available. I could go on with a lot more examples. It's really interesting to get down to, when you can find it, what really went wrong. You don't get to that level very easily. What the level you get to, was this inspired by Russians? What has happened to the people who've been affected and so on? So it used to be said famously, trust and verify. I think that that should be turned around the other way, to verify, verify, and then perhaps you trust. But you don't stay in a position of trusting. You continue to verify. In other words, you cannot really trust. You must take actions. So what we have is two issues here with the behavior of human beings. Those who are responding to phishing and don't really understand the effects of that. Those who do not actually get down to carrying out the proper procedures. And then those, of course, of which Thomas has given us a great understanding, who are deliberately trying to wreck what is going on in a particular organization for their own purposes and in order to take advantage of all the data that they give. And of course, you have others, like Mr. Zuckerberg, who decided it was to his advantage to sell the information. Anyway, the data that he collected through the users of Facebook. So what I wish to emphasize here, it is human beings that are at fault, and limiting the internet, which you suggested at one point, Tom, to democratic companies will not work either. And I want to come back to that point because I think there's other things that we should be doing there. But it's verify before you even think about trusting is the first message. Secondly, we need people in companies of all kinds in charge of the internet to actually really understand how it works. Maybe we should be employing the people that we sometimes derisively call the nerds, because they're very interested in fixing it. Secondly, our regulation should be to the point. But then we should consider with private organizations on the one kind, so you release people's data. Who gets punished for that? Who takes responsibility for that? And I think we should really look at, sometimes, of course, it's not simply a matter of fines, I'm very glad to say. I think fines as a method of enforcement for companies is not a success. And I'm very happy to develop that point as to think why. I want the perpetrators or those who fail to carry out their duties to be punished directly, because only then will they get the message. And with regard to government organizations at every level, who do you hold responsible there? How are you going to ensure that they really do kind of get round and not have to refer it to a committee and another committee before action is taken? So that is my approach. Remember always, it's the human beings that misuse the internet. And we should not consider trying to rebuild an alternative internet, because that simply won't happen. And nor should it be a limited internet globally. I think it's extremely important that we use the same internet, if only, and this is just one reason that I like to think about, how are people who are suffering from oppression and severely authoritarian governments, how are they ever going to get the message out? Tiananmen Square, they used fax machines and sent faxes to Hong Kong. And that's how what was happening in Tiananmen Square spread worldwide, and people were able to pay attention to it, not able to rescue the Chinese, unfortunately, at that time. So it should still be a global internet, but one that we have to use with great caution. Tom, you spelt out how financial Armageddon could take place. And you're probably right, but I hope you're not. But I want to give you just the example of what is going on in Ukraine right now. You are quite correct in saying that some of these services, utilities, in Ukraine were closed down for relatively short periods of time before the invasion. What is Russia now doing with those utilities, which depend, of course, on computers to run them? He's bombing them. Why isn't he actually using the internet to destroy them, save himself the bother of sending troops and tanks and bombs of all kinds out to destroy so many of the utilities in Ukraine? Maybe he has a loss of personnel because of the well-qualified young men who saw it all coming and got out of Moscow as fast as they could, as quickly as possible, so perhaps it's a loss of skilled people. Or perhaps it's something else, because of the activities of others to ensure that the internet in Ukraine is continuing to work. I have good friends there from my work in Ukraine, which is some years past now, and I can communicate with them quite easily. I'm careful in what I say, because I only want to know whether they're alive and well and surviving. So I restrict myself to that. Maybe not necessarily, but also some of the very founders of the internet are actually working in Ukraine to maintain it and possibly to prevent the kind of attack that I have mentioned taking place in Ukraine, not from the use of the internet, but from, shall we say, to Mr. Putin, the old-fashioned methods of blanket bombing of utilities. So by all means, extra protection of every kind is needed, and awareness and education. But let's not close down the internet to such an extent that we cannot communicate globally and easily. Let us instead, don't let the Chinese go and provide the internet in African countries, for example. Nigeria has introduced its own central bank digital currency. Finish this sentence. Availability? Only 51% of the population are able to use CBDC. We would be much better occupied in providing Africa with that ourselves, in letting China, instead of letting China provide it. And they're at the kind of contracts which leave the nations who've borrowed from China holding the debt themselves.
Do I get an introduction?
I gave you one already.
But if I give you a second one.
You want a second one?
Of course, no. Thank you very much, and I'm very glad to be with you this afternoon. Let me say this up front about the book, and you're all going to be able to get a copy of it, and that is, it is not an easy read. In fact, it's a very tough read, and that's what makes it a good book, because it is addressing some extremely important issues that are getting more important by the day. And just one other aspect about the book that's important, and that is, it's amazing the amount of source material that is in there in terms of citations, references to books and articles, glossaries, and so forth. So as a learning experience, it is extremely important as a reference work. So I want to commend Tom on what he has put together there, and I'm already looking forward to future editions of the book. Tom, are you ready to take that on? Turning to the book itself and the issues that have been raised, I want to kind of echo what Oonagh said about what the fundamental problem and that is there are lots of bad guys around the world, and bad women too, that are using and abusing the internet. And I just think that's what we have to live with. And we've always had that problem in society. And so the challenge is to minimize the amount of damage that they can do. Let me give you an analogy that I think of in this regard, and that's shoplifting. Shoplifting has existed as long as there have been stores, and it's everywhere. And so the ongoing challenge to merchants, to business people, is to try and minimize the amount of shoplifting that takes place and related frauds. Well, that's the same issue with the internet. Is there are always going to be bad guys and bad girls out there trying to do or use it for criminal purposes. And so it's just a never-ending job to try and limit the damage that they can do with the internet and using information they gather over the internet. And it's always going to be there as a problem, and we just have to live with that and say we just have to deal with it and not expect it to ever go away. What being someone who focuses on the banking industry, I've looking at it and looking at the issues addressed in the book from a financial data standpoint. And again, I think the issue there is just echoing what's been said already, and that is to make the maximum effort that is possible, both from a human standpoint and a technical standpoint, to protect financial data. That if the bad guys can't get, shall we say, profit from their activities on the internet, then that will take away the incentive to try and misuse it. And so I think that is the major challenge. And now the question becomes of how do you incentivize the activities that are needed to protect, or at least hold to a minimum, the amount of damage and cost caused by that occurs through the misuse of the internet. And I think that the criminal laws can help to some extent, but that's not enough. That there has to be far more in the way of checks and balances, authentication, as has been mentioned, within the organizations themselves that are not only generating data and using data, but in terms of trying to bring data integrity and authentication to the entire universe. And that comes back to a point that I think Tom kind of alluded to, and that is the internet, as it's now structured and operated, up to the task? Or are there going to have to be technological advances that strengthen the integrity of the internet? And in other words, it's a global systems problem to some extent, and one that is going to require technological innovation. And there the question becomes of where is the leadership going to come from to deal with this on a global problem? Because it is a global problem. Tom may have some thoughts to offer in that regard, but I think that is the major challenge, and it's a political challenge because it's going to take governments involved to, shall we say, buy into these international efforts. And what, of course, is going to make that complicated is that we have some countries that kind of like the present anarchy, if you will, that exists out there. And of course, Russia and China are the top two candidates in that regard. And which leads to this question: what can be done, if anything, to try and bring them in, and to realize that it might be in their country's interest to have a safer, more secure global internet? And I think that is I'm not sure that can happen, but I think that has to be an overall objective, that basically everybody's got to participate in trying to make it stronger. And that the emphasis has to be on trying to build the protections into the system right from the get-go. Enforcement's nice to talk about and having criminal prosecutions and so forth, but that is not going to be enough. There has to be the architecture has to be strengthened so that there are fewer cracks in the system, so to speak, that open the door to the bad guys coming through. And again, I'll come back to the what seems like a pretty simple example, and that's shoplifting. But it is something that the merchants of the world never stop trying to deal with, not just to protect it, but to put the systems in place that will defeat the bad guys as they're using technology to shoplift, to steal, or whatever. And so that is probably one of the most important things is the battle never ends. We'll never get to nirvana in that regard. Another issue that the book gets, alludes to a little bit that I think has to be, rethought, and that is the structure of the internet. We want a global internet, global participation, and so forth. But what steps can be taken to build more protections into the internet? I'm not a technical person. I'm a financial person, but I have to. Pardon me. I have to think there are actions that can be taken, and maybe we can talk about that during the discussion period of actions to be taken, not just by governments. It's not enough we can't rely totally on governments, by corporations, other types of organizations, educational institutions, and us as individuals to not just build, but to operate a more secure internet. Because if that doesn't happen, then you will see, as we've already seen to some extent, a fragmentation of the internet, and thereby lose its global value. So this, in a way, comes down to a question of what are the rules and engagement for the internet, which ultimately have to be global rules. And the question I would pose, I don't have the answer for it, but the question I would pose is, has enough work been done on a global basis to establish what the rules should be, so that at least there is something that can be put in place and enforced, or at least hopefully enforced as much as possible. So I just want to close by saying that the internet's somewhat fragile, and probably the major objective of not only governments, but of corporations, of organizations, the think tanks, and so forth, is how to prevent that the internet fragmenting and with more and more protections and barricades put in place. I don't know what the answers are across the board. I don't think any one person does or any one organization, but as the internet becomes more important to global activity, global commerce, and everything else that goes on globally, there has to be an even greater emphasis on trying to strengthen the protections. And basically, we're not going to get rid of the bad guys, but at least to hold the damage that they do to a minimum. With that, I look forward to our discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bert. So before I do a little Q&A, I took away different things from reading the book than Oonagh and Bert. Yeah, they're bad guys. It's not just shoplifting. With the internet, you can download the entire Amazon warehouse. You can steal the whole thing at once. The problem is the internet is so interconnected that the bad guys just don't pilfer one or two things. They can infiltrate entire systems and bring entire banking systems, the whole electrical grid down. So it's verify and trust. But and I think another theme in the book, and Tom can correct me, is that me buying Norton software isn't going to do the trick. That's just not enough. And you can try to protect yourself, but this only goes so far. That there are so many backdoors, and nobody validates the codes, and somebody writes bad code, and there's a way in. There's no accountability. And we create a RoboCop. Okay, maybe we need police, but then we just saw hearings, which I watched all day, unfortunately, the House Financial Services, where all of our regulators, minding the banking system, just said, well, it really wasn't our fault, and we're going to study it. We'll get back to you on that. We have rules and regulations. We might need more, but we just don't know what happened right now, with running the bank SVB. So I'll give you just a couple of minutes to react to what we hear, and then I want to ask a few questions, try to stimulate conversation. Tom?
Yeah, I guess the way I would react is maybe a few bullet points. Number one, the internet isn't global in my view. I mean, Russia's in our internet, we're not in theirs. We're certainly not in China's internet. China has three cables that go into China. They control all the input in the internet in China. They let in to China whatever they want. They let circulate within China whatever they want. They don't have a real internet. And frankly, same thing with Russia. I mean, Russia threw Facebook, Amazon, and all those companies out when the war in Ukraine started. And so we already don't have a global internet. And my reaction, I wrote about this in the book, because I think I had tried to anticipate all the questions that would come up, like how do you do it? And what I go back to as a financial expert is Bretton Woods in 1944. Now, nobody in this room, I guess, was around in 1944.
I was.
Bert was. You remember Bretton Woods? Were you there?
Well, I was 3 years old. I mean, I remember it well.
You weren't. So after the Second World War, all of the countries gathered in a hotel in New Hampshire to try to come to some agreement as to running the global economic mess that was left after the Second World War. Europe was in shambles. Asia was in shambles. Now, what happened at the Bretton Woods Agreement? What happened was we ended up with the dollar as the global reserve currency, and the dollar being linked to gold, which this country held, the IMF and the World Bank being established in Washington, D.C. Why did those things happen? Did they happen because all of the other countries said, yeah, go United States? No, it happened because we were the only major military power left in the world, and we were the only major economic power left in the world. We were the 800-pound parakeet, right? And we said, it's our way or the highway. Now, there's a great book out by Ed Conway called The Summit, which talks about the beginning to the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement and how it happened. There's a lot of great diplomatic language that went back and forth, but at the end of the day, the United States says, we got the money, we got the military, it's our way or the highway. And that has caused tremendously terrific things to happen after the Second World War. I view the internet as the same thing. If you don't want to play by the rules, you're out. You're not in it. Forget it. You don't participate. I don't know why we need a global internet. We're not going to have a global internet to free people. I thought the internet, when it started, would be the greatest way for oppressed people around the world to get freed, because they'll learn, they'll educate, they'll get the message out. No, they don't have it, or they're not allowed to see something on it, or they can't communicate on it, and if they do, their country will annihilate them. So it hasn't worked out that way, and what we've ended up with is a global mechanism to wreak havoc around the world, albeit it is also a mechanism by which a lot of terrific things happen, and I just think that we've got to change our mindset about the internet, because we're all lost in, well, it's there, I'm using it, let's just keep going. I don't think that's the way we work in our analog lives. I don't think that's the way we should work in cyberspace. We should say, wait a minute, this is not working because X is going to happen. How do we fix it?
Okay, so, well, a couple
Can I
things.
respond to that?
You can, but first I'm going to point out Bretton Woods fell apart a few years later because we suspended the gold payments and had huge deficits. Okay, Bert, go ahead.
Well, no, but I think, no, but the point you made exactly the right analogy. I think that you can put some kind of mechanism in place, and Bretton Woods was a good example, but it doesn't last forever. Things change, economies change, the political environment changes. So I think the thing is that the battle is never won. That's number one. It's just an ongoing effort to try and keep things as under control as possible. I think the second thing is that it's going to become increasingly difficult.
But stop there. Maybe we're getting into the Q&A. Who keeps it under control? This is part of the problem. There's a zillion agencies with XYZ acronyms all over who are you going to call? I mean, do you call Ghostbusters? Who? I mean, there's nobody
I
in
agree
charge.
with you. I agree with you. And my sense is,
But the internet doesn't want anybody in charge. Half the internet that's libertarian, that wants to trade crypto anonymously. They're scared to death that a government agency would be in charge.
well, no, I think so. You know, the internet is going to be what it is. It's a question of how people connect to the internet and utilize it. And that's where I think if you're going to put protections in place, it has to be by those who want to access the internet, in effect, have to protect themselves, and through various safeguards. In other words, it's probably unrealistic at this point in time to envision some kind of global agency that's going to be the police.
But if you're forced to use the internet to buy an airplane ticket, bank, the post office wasn't even delivering checks half the time in COVID. I get late payments. You have to go to internet banking. But the person that provides the program for the internet banking leaves a glitch in it. And all of a sudden, you think you're protecting yourself, but somebody gets malware through the back door. This is the point. How could you protect yourself from that?
Well, first of all, you're not going to have perfect protection. But I think you have to do the best you can. And then the question is, what are your fallbacks when something doesn't work? That's what we have lawyers for.
Lawyers.
But also, importantly, insurance. We haven't mentioned it yet, but I think that
It's
insurance...
in the book. It's in the book, insurance.
Yeah, but insurance becomes very important because insurance companies want to try and minimize loss, and they have an incentive to engage in loss protection activities. So, but there's no silver bullet. There's no one way. I think we have to think in terms of and updating constantly the various ways that working together hold losses and damage to an acceptable minimum. Again, I'll come back to the shoplifting example. You never get rid of it altogether, but you take constantly working to try and keep it to a minimum. And I think that same holds true with regard to those who are interacting with the internet, which is everybody, of course, these days.
So there's a number of levels here in the book. Great things that come out. There's thousands of studies, and everybody's in charge, and nobody's in charge. There's the threat of quantum computing, and how close are we to that? And I will tell you, I read that chapter, and I spent a whole afternoon researching quantum computing because I wanted to understand what you were talking about. And this is the kind of book you read something and you go, wait a minute, this looks really important, and then you spend a half an hour and a half looking up other things so you can learn. I mean, how do you authenticate who you're talking to in quantum computing? Well, you use the old light trick where you split light up, and this is very interesting stuff in there, and it's all it's amazing. I didn't know any of this before I read the book, but there's some basic ideas too. And here's one statement that I think is really important. Comes in chapter 17. Anonymity, as it is flaunted in cyberspace, seems to include within it the seeds of our social disintegration. The anonymity. The internet's, anybody can log in to any website. There's no control. Anybody can go on Twitter or Facebook and pretend they're somebody else and bully somebody else. I mean, I think anonymity is a big problem, and the book spends a lot of time on that. We have to verify, as Oonagh wants, verify, and then trust. And then there's the other statement that government protects consumers from many less dangerous things. But can the government really protect us from all this in the current framework? I mean, your opinion is probably not.
Yeah, no, I think that's a terrific question, Paul, because I think there's a misappreciation by the public of what the government does and doesn't do. And I think, you remember that commercial a few years ago, I saw it on the internet, it's got to be true? Well, we live in such a regulatory protected environment where I think most people who are not technology savvy say to themselves, well, if it's happening, it must be okay. It must be all right because the government's letting it happen. And the fact of the matter is the government's not doing anything with respect to the internet or controlling what's there. I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is transparency. The government's got to be transparent about both what it's doing and what it's not doing, because it's not doing a lot more than it's doing. But companies and businesses have to be transparent too. When you buy a refrigerator, you don't think you're buying something that's going to listen to you and report data back to somebody about the food you're eating.
The new 5G ones will.
Right, but they are now. They are now. And when everybody has a chip in every possible thing, when we get the 5G technology with RFID chips everywhere, I mean, somebody said, and I think this is a great quote, everything that's connected is vulnerable and everything will be connected. And so, I think people don't understand what the government is not doing. I don't think they understand how much data is being collected about them and what's being done with it. And I think there's a certain level of transparency and disclosure we've got to start with. But the bottom line is, and I believe this about financial literacy also, if we could just increase the literacy of people on financial matters and on technological matters, they could take the first steps to protect themselves. As a banking regulator for so many years, I was so frustrated with the fact that we had to have so many regulators doing so many things because people couldn't protect themselves in a financial environment. It's the same thing in the technological environment. I don't know why we let kids get out of high school or college without understanding how to protect themselves financially and technologically. How do the kids learn? Their parents give them a phone. That's their lesson. There you go. You're online. Here it is. That's not the way to handle something that can be incredibly dangerous. That book I mentioned, Traces in the Dark, is absolutely frightening. It is absolutely frightening. It's about the story about the investigators at IRS and the FBI who tracked down the people who created the dark web, Alpha A, which is another dark web site, and Welcome to Video. Welcome to Video is the last third of the book. It is just mind-chillingly frightening. It's about two guys, a father and his son, who were found in a shack in South Korea with a server that was serving this Welcome to Video site that had 250,000 videos of children, child sex abuse. And the thing that grabbed me the most about it is that the IRS and the FBI agents who worked on the case and saw the videos needed psychological counseling after they saw what they saw. Yeah. A number of them would not let their children out of their sight ever again. There was one agent who said, I will not let my child go to anybody's house who doesn't have a security clearance. I mean, it was 250,000 of these. And I said, and you say to yourself, what are we doing to ourselves? Because the scale is monstrous, right? When I started in banking, if you wanted to rob a bank, what could you get? You put $100,000 in a valise, you throw it in a van that's waiting. That's the scale of the problem. Last year, $14 billion of cryptocurrency was stolen. $14 billion. That's more that's been taken from every bank robbery in the history of this country at every bank. So the scale of this stuff is changing. And if the scale changes, all I'm saying is we have to scale up our rules and our governance to match it.
So I need psychological counseling sometimes just when I turn on my smart TV because it goes to the wrong thing. Anyway, I'm going to go to the audience for questions. All of us up here are game, but Tom, of course, is the star of the show, so please direct your questions. Yes.
Hi, Shane Tews. I'm here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I promised to read the book. Sounds fascinating. I've been in the cyberspace for over 20 years, and one of the things that we are finding even more challenging now, and I'm a huge fan of zero trust, is I don't believe in privacy. I don't think we really have it anymore. I think the way we've done it in the past, with financial and medical is fine. But I do believe in data protection, and we are in this challenge situation where we're not cultivating the right places to put the gating mechanisms, I think, and the Europeans are helping with that. So do you address that in the book? Because the whole idea of actually being able to have a proper digital identity mechanism would be a huge help here.
Yeah, no, I talk a little bit about digital IDs, and the work the ABA and some other groups are doing towards that goal. And I think that would be a terrific goal. But, you know, we've been down that path before with all kinds of IDs in this country, which eventually get killed somewhere along the legislative process. But I talk about that and what some of the trade associations are doing in that regard. But I think I agree with you. I didn't want to go down the data privacy path too much because that's another whole book, I think. Number one. Number two, I agree with you. There is no privacy. I mean, I think it's a complete myth to think that anybody's got anything private about them. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal just 3 weeks ago about medical data being sold with people's names attached to it. Now, there's some debate about whether that's right or wrong, but the fact of the matter is medical data is being sold all the time on the internet and traded. And so I don't think we have any privacy left. So the question I raise in the book is essentially, what do you do about it at this point, right? How do you solve that problem? And the way I would solve it is, I mean, there's a number of people working on that problem from the point of view of Web3. So for example, there are a lot of people who want to undo the internet by decentralizing it, by bringing back the data, and you hold the data yourself. It doesn't go out online. So maybe that works, maybe it doesn't work. But the point is that I think we are way down the line of a loss of privacy. And frankly, I don't know how to get that back. My formulation was, let's fix the internet first, and privacy may follow.
I'd just like to say a little more about that. First of all, obviously I was not brought up in America, but coming here 5 years ago, I find that America has really been very careless about privacy, not just covering the internet, but anything like putting people's addresses on your checkbook, putting your whole social security number, as was done in the past, on your checkbook. So America doesn't seem to me to have valued privacy or to have found ways of protecting it in the past. So it's going to be even more difficult to think about that in connection with the internet. I do have another problem with this, that in order to establish our identity, you have things, you have your computer like Apple, who wishes to have your fingerprint or use facial identity. And then I sit there and think, yeah, well, that might establish my identity, but where else is that going to go? So that's the problem with seems to me to be one of the problems with digital identity and the requirements. How do you establish that? And how do you retain it? So it might simply be putting the problem back one stage.
Paul, I just wanted to add on. You know, maybe the best thing to do is just to develop a certain sense of paranoia. And
Already there. I'm already there.
Yeah, well, oh right, no, but you know, but to a point, paranoia is okay because that makes you more sensitive to exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about here, and that is taking active steps to try and protect your privacy, at least to some extent. I mean, it's not going to be a black or white solution type of thing. I think what we have to do as individuals is take more responsibility for trying to protect our own privacy, our own data.
You can't live in the modern world and not go on the internet.
It's
almost impossible.
You're right, but I still think that, and I try to practice this every day of, being careful and thinking about it and being aware of what the risks are.
But it's the programs you have to interact with that may not be careful. I mean, you can be as careful as you want, but if there's some back door through the stuff that you have to do your banking or file an insurance claim,
but I still think there's some things that you can do to reduce.
I talk a little bit in the book about the original sin of coding, which the more and more I got into it, and the more I thought about that as a really critical problem, because what happens is you can code and come up with a piece of software, you bring it to the CEO. What does the CEO of the business say? I want to get this thing out quickly as possible. We're going to make $1 million a day, right? Does that shortcut the double checking and the triple checking of that coding? You bet, right? because we have developed a philosophy that seems to be accepted by everybody of launch first and patch second. Once you take that step of launching first and patching second, you have lost the battle with that software, with that coding, and that business. You will never catch up. The bad guys will always be out in front of you.
Yeah. And I want to make an apology. His book has been made into a movie. It was called Die Hard 4. But I couldn't get a good picture off the internet. So I really apologize. I did try. Some more questions from the audience, please. Over here. You can tell us who you are, too. That's always nice.
J.P. Hogan. You praised Clinton. Were you praising him for seeing what should be done, but not for doing?
Yeah, no, well, I was praising really the people who worked for him, obviously, the senior advisors. And what I was saying was they identified the issues in 1996. I don't think he could have, those people could have imagined where the internet would go and how it would have to be changed. It was the successors that I'm really blaming for doing pretty much nothing.
Well, I was concerned that he saw the internet as his tool to fool all the people all the time.
No, that was Al Gore.
Al Gore invented the internet.
But also with the internet and security deterrence, I'm just wondering if there's a moral that's providing. If like China was to go after Taiwan, would they be stealing Taiwan? And why should anyone with foreign debt with China honor their debts to China? So if you have to have a system, is there a moral in the system that would then be workable? Or
Well, you mentioned China and Taiwan. I mean, what I talk about a little bit in the book, which is, again, pretty scary to me, is how China has now created a monopoly on the rare earth minerals that are required to make everything that goes into a computer and a lithium battery. That's number one. But number two, where does 80% of the chips come from? They come from Taiwan. And with China, 80 or 100 miles away from that business, just think about what happened when the supply chains broke down and we didn't get our chips and have the cars manufactured or the refrigerators manufactured. People were waiting 4, 5, 6 months for a refrigerator. If China controls the chip manufacturing in this world, that's a different world that we will be living in.
But Tom, I think that a lot of people do recognize what the chip manufacturing problem is, and that's why we're getting a greater distribution of chip manufacturing across the world for just exactly that reason.
So you bring up one thing I don't remember reading about, which you can put in your next edition, is intellectual theft, which has got to have gone through the roof with the internet. I mean, you talk about crypto heists and other kind of heists, but the intellectual property that's been stolen using the internet has got to be astronomical in value.
Yeah. I actually had a chapter about that in my other book, 200 Years of American Financial Panics, which sort of was the prequel to this book, because in that book, I basically said technology will change the delivery and the creation of financial services in massive ways, and we have to be ready to deal with it. And one of them, and I did talk about the theft of intellectual data in some great degree. And look, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a function of the ease of getting at that data now. There's an interesting sort of conundrum we've got here in terms of fixing the internet. When Sony Pictures was hacked, right, and all that information went out, what could Sony Pictures do about it? Well, it's against federal law for Sony Pictures to do anything about it. They couldn't hack back, right? They had to call the government and say, this has happened to us, what are you going to do? And the government says, we'll figure it out, we'll put it into our diplomatic machine and we'll come up with some sort of response. So the problem is you've got 95% of the internet owned by corporations, businesses, and users, us, who are the main owners and users of the internet, but you've got no way to defend it except a government which isn't really defending it. And so companies can't hack back. It's a really peculiar situation. It's not like the defense of our borders, where you expect the army to shoot back and defend the borders. It's not happening in cyberspace.
It's not happening either at our border.
Right. It's not happening either at the borders. So
Jump in on that. It's essentially an intellectual theft, property theft issue, and for which the courts and the legal profession have got to adapt to do it. My father and grandfather were patent attorneys. Their whole livelihood was suing people over, in terms of patent infringers and so forth, and violators of copyrights. And I think that same notion has to carry forward, that somewhere in all this we have to have the judicial system that is has the capacity to deal with litigation that arises out of intellectual property theft.
Yes,
And
but
maybe
you-
the law isn't keeping up.
Bert, if you think lawyers and judges are going to solve this problem and save us, I got a bridge to sell you.
No, they're not going to say this, but I think there has to be ample opportunity for those who have been damaged to seek some kind of restitution in the courts.
Well, the problem is it's not only courts in America.
Yeah.
Because the whole NFT business was, in fact, originally it said, oh, well, you see, artists can now sell their original drawing on the internet, and people will pay for it. Yes, of course, people will pay for it. But you have no idea where else in the entire world that picture could be reduced. So if you're a purchaser of an artist's NFT, then what do you actually own? What can you actually say remains in your possession? It doesn't. If it may do here, perhaps, if the law recognizes that, but there's no guarantee that it will remain in your possession in any other country in the world, because the approach to intellectual property disappears or is not recognized at all.
Some more questions from the audience, please? Right here.
Thanks. My name is John Carlson. I agree, Tom, with both your wife and you in that it was a scary book. I felt like it gave me a little bit of PTSD, having been in this space for a long time, but I also thought it was hopeful in terms of laying out some potential paths forward. So my question really has to do with how in financial services we oftentimes have these crises and then there are reforms. And also financial institutions live within this ecosystem, so they're really involved in risk management. So my question is, if the current round of bank failures was due to a cyber event or some sort of massive operational event, what type of reforms do you think would follow from that? And could they actually ever be implemented?
Yeah, John, that's a great question. And John is one of the preeminent financial cyber experts in the country, and I really enjoy talking with him and asking him questions, which sort of led to this book. I mean, it was conversations with John and Brian Peretti at the Treasury that sort of gave me the idea about this book, and I admire what they do and how they've done it for very long. But, you raise a ticklish question for me, because my other book was about how governments create crisis and how they misreact to the crisis afterwards. So in the book, I say there's a 50% chance that a coming financial crisis will be because of a cyber event. And I talk about how it could happen and so on and so forth. And so your question is, how would the government react? Is an interesting question, because I have no confidence that anybody on the Hill understands much of the depth of technology and what it even means to talk about some of these issues we've talked about here today. You saw in their questioning of Mark Zuckerberg and other technology professionals and executives, their level of knowledge and the questions they're asking is pretty academic and pretty basic, right? And so what happens? What happens is exactly what's going to happen in this crisis. And having been involved in so many financial crises, I think there's a playbook, and the playbook will be, Congress will never realize that it's some of the laws we've created that have misdirected policies that have caused the crisis that we've got, right? The regulators will never take responsibility for their role in a crisis. What does that mean? Number one, it means we have to find the boogeyman or the villain. We have to march them into the town square and flog them. And in every crisis in this country, you can name the boogeyman, right? WAMU was Kerry Killinger. Bernie Madoff, Drexel, Mike Milken. There's always a boogeyman. And when we find the boogeyman, we're happy, right? It's like a plane goes down and we blame the pilot and everybody feels better. Well, it wasn't the plane, it was pilot error. It's the same thing that goes on here. And so what's going to happen? What's going to happen when we have our first cyber attack on the financial system is we will end up with much more regulation, which will not solve the problem, because we have a misfitted regulatory system to begin with. Financial institutions in this country wake up every day. If you have a national franchise in a financial institution, meaning you're making mortgages, for example, nationwide, you wake up every day with about 165 regulators to satisfy. That is nuts. It's absolutely nuts. And those regulators don't like each other, and they're fighting for jurisdiction, and they're fighting for press release priority all the time. I mean, it's a crazy system. To say that we're having financial crisis one after another is no surprise if you understand how out of date and how redundant and just horrible the system is. So this system was put in place in the 1930s. Does anybody think anything about the economy today looks like the 1930s? Have we updated it? Well, we've put some Band-Aids and some spit and glue on it. But John, at the end of the day, what we'll do is we'll end up with more regulations and more laws to put more burdens on the people who follow the law, and more paperwork and more costs on the people following the law, and it won't change a thing, and it won't help anything.
Tom, then what's the better approach? What can be done differently than just repeating what's been done in the past?
I go back to what I said in the White House 6 years ago. I said, number one, we have to change the regulatory system to make it more efficient. We end up regulating the wrong things for the wrong reasons at the wrong time. And it's not because of any venality on anybody's part. It's because the system is just misfocused. The laws tell the regulators what to do, and some of those laws are absolutely nuts. I mean, they're out of date. For example, in 2008, all of the institutions went down because they started because of a liquidity crisis, right? What did we do? We passed a law that said you need more capital. I'll tell you, Bear Stearns, Merrill Lynch, Lehman Brothers, they could have had 100% capital. When that liquidity crisis started, they were going down. There was no chance to stop it. And so we end up writing laws, always fighting the last battle. So number one, I would get rid of 150 of the regulators we've got. I don't know why we have state regulators in a system where we have no borders anymore. You have to think about what the dual role of banking is when you have no borders. And once you get the system streamlined, then you have a chance. Number two, you have to have somebody in charge of cyberspace. There's nobody in charge of cyberspace in this country. Somebody's got to be, and I mean that only because I don't want more rules. It means I want somebody responsible. I want to go to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and I say, you're the general in charge, you screwed up. Today, there's nobody to go to. There's nobody in charge. So we can't have a system with lots of rules and regulations with 150 agencies just peddling them all the time and think that it's going to make any difference.
So we don't even know who decided the balloon could go over the United States yet. They can't even figure that out.
So we need a czar.
Well, can I
Bizarre.
come in with a comment here?
Sure.
I hate to sort of shout about the UK in this way, but we do have a set of principles, 11 principles, which were devised originally by Sir David Walker when he was chairman of the Securities and Investments Board. When it came to the collapse of Lehman Brothers, when it came to the whole LIBOR scandal, it was not actually the responsibility of the regulators, it was the responsibility of the British Bankers Association, a very odd setup there, which was a trade association for banks. But nevertheless, the FSA was able to prosecute all of the individuals involved in the various banks. Why? Because they could cite one of the principles and then show that in no way did the behavior of those involved in all the corruption scandal that went on, the LIBOR scandal, and they were able to punish them appropriately. So maybe in the cyberspace, we not only need somebody who's responsible, but we need some general principles And where it applies to some agencies, those concerned with national security, the principle could quite simply take the form: if you show anybody else any of the information that you have derived from a computer or in any other way, you're a traitor and you're out. That's it.
To Oonah's point about enforcement, so it just shows you sort of the transparency of what we're doing in terms of enforcement. Every once in a while, the Attorney General will go to the podium and will have an announcement that 7 or 8 Iranians or Russians have been indicted. Well, that does it, right? We've indicted people who will never come to this country, never be arraigned, never be arrested, never serve a day in prison. It's just, sort of action without progress, right? It's just trying to show we're doing something because we better be doing something, because look at all these hacks, look at all this ransomware. We couldn't get gas on the East Coast when Colonial shut down, right? We better have some answers to that. And the real answer is we don't have answers to it.
Well, hold on. There are some answers in this book, and I've got to call time now, so Tom has time to sign the books in the back. We have books for you all. I hope we have enough to go around for those that want it, and you can get an autograph. And I think we have some refreshments too. So first, thank you very much. This is a very interesting conversation. It could go on for a lot longer, but we got to sign some books. So let's thank the panel here and Tom.